All right, so we've just seen how tearing the agricultural population from the land created a brand new home market for industry. But that begs a pretty big question, right? Where did the industrial capitalists themselves come from? You see, Marx points out a real puzzle here. The capitalist farmer, well, that was a slow burn, an evolution over centuries. But the industrial capitalist, they seem to appear on the scene with incredible speed and force. There's just no way that story can be explained by, a few small-time guild masters or artisans patiently saving up their pennies. So this chapter is all about digging into the real and frankly brutal story of how this new class was born.
So where do we start? Well, Marx kicks things off by taking a sledgehammer to the story we're often told. The fairy tale of the virtuous capitalist. The idea that capital comes from some diligent, frugal person who abstained from spending their money. Marx just finds this completely ridiculous. It's a justification, not an explanation. And his jab here is just brilliant. If you think about it, he's saying that every action is just abstinence from its opposite. So eating is abstinence from fasting. Walking is abstinence from sitting still. It's a completely meaningless statement, a clever-sounding phrase that's really designed to hide what actually happened.
And here, we really see the stark difference between that myth and the reality Marx lays out. Forget diligence, think conquest. Forget frugal saving, think enslavement. Abstinence? No, it was robbery. Peaceful enterprise? Try murder. The point Marx is driving home is that the birth of capital wasn't some quiet, virtuous affair. It was incredibly violent. And he puts it in some of his most famous words. He says, this story is written in the annals of mankind in letters of blood and fire. Okay, so this brings us to the absolute core concept for this whole part of capital. It's a term you've got to understand. Primitive accumulation. Think of it as the original sin of the whole system. Now, this definition is absolutely crucial. When Marx talks about primitive accumulation, he is not talking about a person saving up money. Not at all. He's talking about a massive historical process. It's the process of forcibly separating the producer, the worker, from the things they need to produce, like land or tools. This violent divorce is what creates the two sides of the coin you need for capitalism to even get started. You get a small class of people who own all the stuff, and a huge class of people who own nothing but their ability to work. And that's why his analogy to original sin is so powerful. It's not something that happens within capitalism. It's the violent event that happens before it, the thing that makes the whole system possible in the first place. And again, he doesn't pull any punches. This isn't some gentle shift in the economy. It's a brutal historical break from the past written, you guessed it, in blood and fire. So let's break this down into its two main pillars. First up, how do you create a proletariat? I mean, for capitalism to work, you absolutely have to have a massive group of people who have no choice but to sell their ability to work. And historically, where did that group come from? Well, they were created by force, by kicking the agricultural population off their land. This brings us to a really crucial and kind of ironic point Marx makes about what it means to be a free laborer. You see, the worker is free in two ways. On the one hand, they are free from the old bonds of feudalism. They're not a serf tied to the land. They can, in theory, sell their labor to whoever they want. But, and this is the big but, they are also free from owning anything else. They've been freed from their land, their tools, any way of making a living on their own. So it's this double meaning, freedom to sell your labor and freedom from owning anything else, that really defines the modern working class. And make no mistake, this didn't just happen overnight. This wasn't some natural evolution. As you can see here, it was a centuries-long, deliberate, and often violent campaign. Starting in the late 15th century, you have the enclosure of common lands. Then in the 16th century, the Reformation sees huge amounts of church property seized, literally throwing people out onto the streets. By the 17th and 18th centuries, this process becomes systematic, with the state using the law itself to steal land from communities. Every single step was designed to create a bigger and bigger pool of people with absolutely nothing to their names. And what's fascinating is that people at the time saw this happening. It wasn't some secret. Thinkers like Francis Bacon were writing about the devastation it caused. He talks about how turning farmland into sheep pastures for the booming wool trade, well, it led to a decay of people. He saw firsthand that this transformation was literally driving people off the land, creating this new, mobile, landless workforce that was essential for the factories to come. Okay, so pillar number 1 is in place. You've got a workforce. Now for pillar number 2,
where did the actual capital come from? I mean, the huge piles of money needed to build the factories and employ all these people, where'd that originate?
Well, surprise, surprise, it wasn't from saving up pocket money. Marx points to a whole list of sources, and they're pretty grim. We're talking about the plunder of gold and silver in the Americas, the enslavement and murder of indigenous populations, the looting of the East Indies, turning Africa into, in his words, a warren for the commercial hunting of blackskins. And on top of all that, you have the modern systems of national debt, credit, and tariffs, all of which were tools used by the state to basically fast-track to hothouse the accumulation of massive wealth into the hands of a few.
Now, this is where it gets really interesting. The colonies act as a kind of perfect experiment for Marx's theory. Because what happens when you have these two pillars separated? What if you have free laborers, but they also have access to free land? This situation created a massive headache for capitalism, and in doing so, revealed its secret inner workings. A guy named E.G. Wakefield, an economist at the time, figured out the problem perfectly. He complained that in the colonies, you just couldn't get people to work for you, not for any price. And why would they? If land is cheap or free, a person can just go work for themselves, become an independent farmer. They have absolutely zero reason to sell their labor to a capitalist. So you had this bizarre situation where all this capital was being shipped from Europe to the colonies, and it was just sitting there, useless, because there was nobody to work for it.
And Wakefield's solution is the real giveaway. Marx loves this part because it basically proves his entire point. Wakefield argued that the state needed to step in and artificially jack up the price of land. Not because of supply and demand, but just to make it so expensive that new immigrants would be forced to work for someone else for years, maybe decades, before they could even dream of buying their own plot. In other words, you had to manufacture a working class. You had to artificially create the very conditions of landlessness that had been created by force back in Europe.
So, when you put the history of Europe together with this experiment in the colonies, the secret of accumulation becomes crystal clear. It really boils down to two essential moves. Step 1, separation. You take the great mass of people and you violently divorce them from their means of making a living, their land, their tools, whatever. That creates your proletariat. Step 2, concentration. You take all that stuff that was just expropriated, the land, the tools, and you concentrate it into the hands of a tiny minority. That becomes capital. And these aren't two different stories. They're two sides of the very same coin. One can't happen without the other.
So, the big takeaway from this chapter is this. The industrial capitalist didn't just appear because of saving. It was the result of the violent creation of a whole new system based on wage labor. Primitive accumulation isn't a result of capitalism. It's the violent setup. It's what puts the game board in place, creating that fundamental split between capital on one side and labor on the other.
And that leaves us with a huge, lingering question, doesn't it? If brute force and outright violence is the secret to how capitalism was born, then what's the secret to how it keeps going? How does it reproduce itself day after day? Well, that's exactly where Marx is headed next, and we'll dig into it when we look at the historical tendency of capitalist accumulation.